Prologue. Australia, 2023. Over 40 years of pursuing the truth about what happened to Kincora Boys Hostel in East Belfast had led me to the home of Arthur Smith, one of the boys whose lives was irrevocably changed by the horrors he experienced during his short stay in that place. Having interviewed a number of the survivors from Kincora, I found Arthur's story to be a familiar one. Sent to Kincora by a Belfast divorce court judge who thought Arthur would be safe there, instead he was continually preyed upon by the pedophiles who ran the hostel. Particularly cruel was William McGrath, the so-called beast of Kincora, who manipulated the 11-year-old boy into silence about his constant sexual attacks by threatening him with never seeing his sister again. But then came something unexpected. The story of a man Arthur knew only as Dickie, another sexual predator who was given access to Arthur by McGrath more than once. In his interview, Arthur recalled their first meeting. Dickie asked me to stand on top of like a box or something on the floor next to a desk. And he was wearing something black at the time, a jacket. He took it off and put it over a chair. And then I just remember him telling me to take my pants down. He then proceeded to lean me over the desk. At the time of the rapes, Arthur had no idea who Dickie was. Then, 2 years later, he was watching the television when a story appeared about an IRA bombing. It was 27 August 1979, and such stories were nothing new for the people of Northern Ireland. But Arthur was not prepared for what he was about to see. Dickie's face suddenly appeared on screen. On that day, Arthur Smith learned that one of the men who had so brutally used him, the man he had known as Dickie, was in fact Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, 1st Earl Mountbatten of Burma, member of the royal family and cousin to Queen Elizabeth II. He had just been murdered by the IRA, who booby-trapped his boat in County Sligo. The realization broke Arthur. I went up to my bedroom. I started crying. I felt sick. That someone in high stature like this could do such a thing. Because we all think that a pedophile is a bloke that you don't know, that he's weird looking, or he doesn't look right. But he fooled everybody. He was a pedophile, and people need to know him for what he was, not for what they're portraying him to be. The involvement of a member of the British royal family in the Kincora scandal is only one strand in a complicated web of cover-ups, obfuscation and denial on the part of the British authorities, in which MI5 plays a starring role. It is a story I have dedicated my career to revealing. Chapter 2. A House of Horrors. I had barely got my feet properly under my BBC news desk when I was embedded into the story that introduced me to my first ever long-term investigation. Just 5 months into my BBC career, there began for me a lifetime link to the dreadful story of sexual violence against young men and boys living in Kincora. The deeper I dug, the clearer the realization became that the British state had failed to protect these young men and boys from enduring ongoing sexual exploitation. But the big question was why? As I started my investigation into what had happened at Kincora, it seemed to me that the first thing I needed to do was to trace former Kincora residents. As many had built new lives far removed from their bitter experiences inside the hostel, my approach had to be made with tact. But many of them seemed relieved finally to discover someone who was prepared to listen and give the oxygen of publicity to their painful plight. Early on, I travelled to London to meet a former resident called Simon, name changed for his protection, a survivor of sexual abuse at Kincora. He was well-spoken and extremely articulate. Seated in a bar on Marylebone Road, not far from Madame Tussauds, he openly admitted to having a close sexual relationship with Joe Mains. Simon said in normal circumstances he would not have been placed in Kincora. He was there on a voluntary basis because he could not live with his parents who had difficulties accepting his homosexuality. When he arrived in Kincora, he was 15 or 16 years of age and once there, he provided sexual favours to Mains because he got privileges in return, such as being free on occasion to ignore Kincora's midweek or weekend curfews. Simon told me that Mains did not like McGrath at all and complained to him that McGrath had been appointed on the recommendation of two senior individuals in social services, and that he, Mains, had not been consulted in the appointment process. Simon claimed Mains could have run Kincora on his own, and went on to describe him as the father figure, referring to Semple and McGrath as the ugly sisters. When McGrath arrived on the scene, Simon resisted his sexual advances for a number of months, but eventually gave in to help maintain the kind of curfew privileges he had established with Mains, especially useful when McGrath was on night duty. But he stressed that he hated McGrath. Despite this dislike, he described McGrath as a good talker who was pushed forward by Mains and Semple to deal with social workers calling to discuss complaints from residents of sexually inappropriate behaviour on the part of Kincora staff. When Simon was leaving Kincora, McGrath told him it was a pity he had not been more cooperative sexually, as he, McGrath, had a friend who could have fixed him up with a flat. This was something McGrath had offered to another Kincora resident who, like Simon, flatly rejected the offer. Naturally, it was not possible for me to trace every former resident. However, I was fortunate to get copies of the transcribed witness statements taken by police during their 1980 investigation, which formed a major part of the book of evidence produced for the court case against the Kincora staff and three others. But because all the accused admitted to sexual offences, there was no ventilation of the dreadful facts these statements contained. They make very uncomfortable reading even now, 4 decades on. Shockingly, the details described by several survivors reveal that some sort of pedophile network appeared to exist, which actively shared information about boys who were both vulnerable and easily manipulated. This is clear from the story of Robert, name changed for his protection, who was placed in care when he was just 7 years of age. He had 3 sisters and a brother also in care. Robert was 17 years old when he was sent to Kincora, and almost immediately was approached by Mains, who wanted Robert to wank him. Robert told police officers that after he rejected Mains, the Kincora warden said, "Come on, I was told you do that sort of thing." Mains didn't reveal who had told him this, but as a result, Robert allowed himself to be drawn into Mains' sexual orbit. He and Mains immediately stripped off their clothing and from that day on became regular sexual partners. Within 4 weeks, Robert was confronted by Semple as he vacuumed the bedroom. He told police, "Raymond Semple spoke to me one day and said that I was to give him a wank because if I could do it to Joe Mains, I could do it to him." Soon he was having full sexual intercourse with Semple in Semple's bedroom nearly every day or night. He also ended up having intercourse with Mains until at the age of 18 he left Kincora. Even after this, Robert continued his relationship with Semple as both were stewards at the Oval Football Ground in East Belfast. He also described to police how the last time he had sex with Semple or any other man was in the mid-1970s, 2 years before he got married. In a lengthy statement to detectives, another Kincora resident, Billy, recalled the night he was raped for the first time by William McGrath. Billy had been transferred to Kincora in the summer of 1975 from the Bonmore home in North Belfast, where he had been placed when his parents split up. He told detectives, "Both Mr. Mains and Mr. Semple were very kind to me. After 2 or 3 months in Kincora, Mr. Semple took me to Cantrell and Cochrane and got me a job on a delivery lorry." However, his experience with McGrath was entirely different. Soon after he started work with Cantrell and Cochrane, he was invited by McGrath into a bathroom at Kincora. McGrath locked the door behind him, which surprised Billy. McGrath was facing Billy. He never spoke, just reached out, unfastened Billy's trousers and pulled them and his underpants down before removing his own clothes from the waist down. What Billy experienced next was horrific. Mr. McGrath then told me to put my hand down and hold on to the toilet seat. He then took hold of me round the tummy underneath my clothes and stood behind me. I can't remember if he said anything, but I didn't say anything. I then felt his cock entering my arse. It was very painful, and I screamed out. He seemed to go into me for 2 or 3 inches. He then started to push in and out of me. It was very sore at the time. He had been doing this to me for about 10 minutes and was still inside me with his cock when I heard the doorbell ring. McGrath had locked the front door as normal at night time. Billy's ordeal came to an end. He and McGrath pulled their trousers back up in total silence. He followed McGrath down the hall as he went to answer the front door, and Billy turned into the television room. Moments later, Eddie Walker and another Kincora resident entered the TV room along with McGrath. They sat down and watched television with Billy and McGrath until Billy went to bed at around 11 p.m. Even though McGrath's abuse continued until Billy left Kincora in May or June 1974, he never told anyone what had been done to him. Giving the police his statement was, he told the detectives, the first time he had spoken to anyone about it. His description on that first assault stunned detectives because it closely resembled what another boy, Sammy, had experienced with McGrath and served to underscore the reasons why McGrath would become known to the police as the Beast of Kincora. While some of the survivors of sexual abuse at Kincora understandably requested anonymity, another survivor of abuse there was willing to speak out publicly. Hugh Quinn was happy to be identified. He had spent his whole childhood in care, having been abandoned by his mother at birth because she thought he stood a better chance in public care than with her in poverty. His memories of an upbringing in institutions of the state reveal that there was little love or affection in a system that victimized those least able to speak up for themselves. By the time he reached Kincora, he had already endured abuse, although it did not prepare him for what lay ahead. Born on 13 December 1945 in a workhouse on the Lisburn Road in Belfast, Hugh recalled, "My mother abandoned me at the workhouse. She simply could not afford a home for us. When the workhouse disappeared in 1948 with the introduction of the National Health Service, I was placed in a home called Bonmore. It was marvellous, and the matron at the home was Mrs. Minnie Wilson, the one person I grew to love and trust. She became my mother figure." But his contentment was not to last, as he was moved from one institution to another until he eventually wound up in Kincora. During my stay in one particular home, I developed temper tantrums, which resulted in the decision to move me to Kincora. Even though I was younger than the other boys, it was thought that Joe Mains could control me. From his very first day there, Quinn was to discover the type of control Mains would establish over him. I remember the first day I arrived at Kincora, Joe Mains took me to the bathroom. He told me to strip naked, and he gave me what he called a medical examination. This entailed him putting his hand around my testicles and asking me to cough. At one point he said, "Aren't you a big boy for your age?" When he said this, he was looking at my penis. I was embarrassed. Later he invited me to his bedroom. Under threat of sending me to a borstal, he forced me to masturbate him and kiss him on the lips. Soon, he started asking me to have anal sex with him. During the next 3 years, he had intercourse with me once or twice a week. I was 14 when this happened. I was an orphan from birth, and by this stage, I was institutionalized. I could not bring myself to complain about Mains because he was such a highly regarded person who told me that no one would believe me if I created trouble. I could be sent to borstal. I had no family. The people at Kincora were the closest I had to family. Quinn acknowledges that the sexual favours he provided for Mains bought certain privileges, but he is also sure he was not alone in being asked to provide them. On the nights he did not sleep with Mains in the warden's private accommodation, others did. Quinn saw Main collect other boys from the dormitory upstairs. His statement reveals part of Main's modus operandi. Unlike the other members of staff, Mains lived on the premises. He had a self-contained ground floor apartment at the rear of Kincora, which could be entered from inside the hostel and also had a separate entrance off North Road. Having singled out one of the boys for his special attention, Mains would use his authority to find out if the individual concerned would offer strong resistance or not. And, if not, a catalogue of abuse would begin. For those who complied with Main's wishes and did not kick up a fuss, there were trips to the theatre, to bars and clubs. Even driving lessons were offered as rewards. Quinn himself was taken to places where homosexuals gathered clandestinely at the time, the early 1960s. There was the Queen's Court Hotel in Bangor, where we were brought many times. I remember on one occasion I was introduced to pop singer Eden Kane, who was performing at the hotel at the time. Sometimes Mains, who was bisexual, would bring his girlfriend on these trips and we would go to dances together. But most of the time, we were in the company of gays. Other venues described by Quinn as homosexual haunts were Matthew's Cafe in Belfast city centre and the Royal Avenue Bar at the Avenue Hotel. Quinn recalled, "He would take me there to meet other gays. Mains knew the comedian James Young very well and Jack Hudson, Young's partner and mentor. I was often in their company and we got tickets for the show and were permitted to go backstage afterwards." Mains was so confident of his control over Quinn that he took him to meet not just homosexuals, but his own relatives and friends. One relative was a senior policeman who was ignorant of Mains' activities. Quinn briefly entertained thoughts of telling him that Mains was sexually abusing boys at the hostel, but the fear of not being believed quickly drove such thoughts away. Given Quinn's early introduction to homosexuality, it is perhaps not surprising that he blames his treatment at Kincora for his own sexual orientation. "I had relationships with girls," he said sourly, "but I found I was incapable of maintaining a relationship and ended up seeking the company of other men. I was even engaged to be married once, but could not go through with it. How would my wife react when I told her about my past? And what about children in the future? The truth is that Joe Mains made a mess of my life." Hugh Quinn was not the only resident over the years to fall under the influence of Mains. On occasion, Mains would take one of the young Kincora residents to his girlfriend's house to help with gardening chores. One resident was asked if he wanted to stay there for the night. According to the young man's statement to police, as the girlfriend slept upstairs, Mains had sex with him in the living room below. Other ex-residents I tracked down described how they were taken out of Kincora by Mains and driven in his car to hotels where they had sex with other men, often after a couple of intoxicating refreshments. According to a statement taken by the police, in March 1966, 4 boys got together to write a letter of complaint about sexual abuse by staff at Kincora. It was addressed to the Welfare Department of Belfast Corporation, which had responsibility for running the hostel. One of the boys involved was nicknamed Shuggy, and he was witnessed by one of the other boys posting the letter in the mailbox at the corner of North Road opposite Kincora. However, the witness also noted that nothing ever seemed to come of this written complaint. 12 months later, things had not improved for Shuggy, who continued to face sexual violence in Kincora. In 1967, he was named in a witness statement made to police by Colin, name changed for his protection, about his experience of Kincora. Colin described being placed in Kincora after leaving school in 1967. He was affronted when Mains approached him in the washroom at summer camp in Portrush and asked, "Do I not get a kiss then?" This was closely followed by Mains putting his hand inside Colin's trousers. Colin told police he pulled Mains' hand out and told him to fuck off. He went on to tell the police that Mains expressed his disappointment by punishing him for this rejection. He was made go to bed at 7 each night for the next few weeks. He was also made to scrub floors in the house and work in the garden. Shuggy had complained to Colin that Mains told him he was lovely when he was having a bath and later turned up in his room, where Mains put his hands under the bedclothes and felt all over his body. Colin told detectives that after returning from the summer camp, he went with Shuggy into Belfast city centre to report their complaints to Belfast Corporation's Welfare Department. The police were able to get Colin to confirm that a written statement they had in their possession and dated to 8 September 1967 was the one he personally wrote out while at the welfare offices. Colin said that when he and Shuggy returned to Kincora, Mains challenged them on where they had been. He started shouting at us and told me to bend over a table in his office. I refused. At this time, he had a length of wooden rod in his hand and he intended to hit me. I told him he wouldn't be hitting me because I had reported him to the welfare and they were coming to see him. Main's attitude changed immediately. Colin said his nerves went and he started giving Shuggy and me cigarettes. His hands were shaking. He asked me what I said to the welfare. I said, I've told them everything. This frightened him and he didn't say anything else. I'm nearly sure he started giving us money as well while we were in his office. Colin recalled the two people from the welfare coming to Kincora, but he'd never discovered the outcome of the visit. He left Kincora a month later for the final time to return to his family home. The written statements made by Colin and Shuggy were passed on to Henry Mason, the city welfare officer at the time. On 8 September, Mason interviewed Joe Mains at some length. Mains claimed he had put his hand down the boy's pants because the individual concerned was inclined not to change his underclothes, frequently keeping the clean set in his locker. On the question of asking for a kiss, Mains said that this was an attempt to shame the boy into getting his long hair cut, and he admitted using the same question in an attempt to embarrass the other boy as well. Having considered Mains' explanations, Mason judged them plausible. He forwarded his report to the town clerk with the conclusion that there was no evidence to constitute a prima facie indication of wrongful conduct. 4 years later, on 21 August 1971, Henry Mason sent details of another complaint about Mains, as well as his record of the 1967 complaints, to the town solicitor John A. Young. On this occasion, the young man who made the complaint had managed, under extreme duress, to maintain his strength and reject Mains' sexual advances. But it seems that this file disappeared with no evidence of any response, let alone action, from the town's solicitor's office. There may be a very simple explanation for this apparent inaction. The late John Young was a practicing homosexual, active among a small coterie of men that included Joe Mains. With Young, Semple and Mains formed a triumvirate that was able to keep complaints from the young male residents of Kincora under wraps. In spite of the growing number of complaints against him, Mains managed to keep his job and clearly still enjoyed the trust of his employers. He was able to give plausible explanations for any complaints that could not be stifled by his influential friends. In 1983, an inquiry led by Sir George Terry would criticise the police for not acting more decisively on early reports of abuses in Kincora. In 1985, a report published by Judge William Hughes at the conclusion of his inquiry into Kincora was similarly critical of the social services. What is abundantly clear from the authorities' lack of action over those early complaints from Kincora residents is that Mains and Semple might have continued to get away with their crimes for many more years if it had not been for the employment of William McGrath.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.